with some theologians and philosophers in California through the Claremont Center for Process Studies. It was pretty cool to get an invitation, and I felt a bit like the country doctor invited to sit in on the medical symposium at the big city. It was enjoyable to re-engage with process theology again, to learn a bit more about it all. One piece I found most interesting in the faith and process goal that they had was to expand the conversation beyond their usual Christian circles. Process theology began within Christianity. I have appreciated that goal because I have that same goal. And I was included in their circle as a Unitarian Universalist because of that goal. I recall an informal conversation at one point when several of the regular attendees were talking about how they were confused about the Unitarian Universalist atheists in our mix. They had heard we UUs were excited about a version of process theology that did not have a God component. And they wondered together how that could be. How could you remove God from Whitehead's basic theology? Well, I was excited by this question. I think in that informal chatting moment, I said something in response, but not anything all that helpful, I'm sure. I remember saying something about how I have seen a non-theistic version of process theology that makes a lot of sense, and that several people in my congregation have talked about it. And I may have said at the time that I felt the secret is to start with the science and go from there. Of course, before I go into the detail about that, I need to give a little more context about process theology. It's a modern theological offshoot of liberal Protestant theology. It says that everything is in process. Everything is changing, becoming. The world, the universe, everything is wholly and fully natural and creative. The implication here is that God also is in process, is changing and becoming. In process theology, God is not outside of the universe. God is not immutable and unchanging either, and certainly not supernatural. This is a God who is not judgmental or controlling. Instead, this is a God who is creative and loving and part of the unfolding natural universe. You'll notice perhaps that this description I have given of process theology is very God-centric. Fair enough. Here are some characteristics of process theology that are not about God. Everything is interconnected. Everything is part of the natural universe. Human beings have full free will. There's no determinism or fate. And the biggie, events are the primary building block of the universe, not substances. That last one about events is where the real fun and the notable distinction of this theology begins to kick in. So, the father of process theology, Alfred North Whitehead. Trained in mathematics and logic and science, he had a spiritual bent, and he developed his metaphysics of process philosophy at that time about 100 years ago. So this is not all that old. His theology was rooted in the modern breakthroughs of physics and science, which had undergone seismic shifts leading up to his lifetime. In the 1600s, the church served as the custodian of science. The Holy Roman Church provided a complete worldview for science that remained safely within the framework of the Bible and biblical teachings. But with Copernicus and Bruno and Galileo, the church began to lose its hold on the scope of scientific exploration. And from that time through to Darwin's theory of evolution in the 19th century, scientific inquiry continued to break free from the church's control. So in the early 1900s, with Newtonian physics beginning to crumble under Einstein's exploration, Alfred North Whitehead took this remarkable step. Instead of letting his science be confined by his religion, he let his religion be confined within his science. Science was revealing some very interesting possibilities about the basic foundation of reality as we know it. And this circles back to that key idea in process theology about events being the primary reality rather than substances. This is the root idea of modern physics as well. We tend to think of things, right? As substances. Traditional philosophy and physics talks about how the universe is made up of these substances. We are organisms made of organ systems, which are made of tissues, which are made of cells, which are made of molecules, which are made of atoms, right? Which are made of subatomic parts. Physicist Richard Feynman once said, all things are made of atoms. Seems pretty basic, right? But things are not all there is in the universe. Yes, all things are made of atoms, but there's also energy, for example. In his book, A Short History of Nearly Everything, Bill Bryson writes, "It is a slightly arresting notion that if you were to pick yourself apart with tweezers one atom at a time, you would produce a mound of fine atomic dust, none of which had ever been alive and all of which had once been you." Energy is not a substance, it's not a thing. It is what exists between the things or in them, perhaps. I don't really know. It's sometimes tricky for me to talk about science and physics from the pulpit when I know there's some actually PhD level nuclear physicists and particle physicists in the room. But the relationship dynamic is essential. It's what makes that mound of fine atomic dust you. The relational interaction of the parts is what matters. Pardon the pun. The basic building blocks of life are not the things, but the relationships among the things. That's what process theology is saying. I'm essentially, in physical terms, an organism of about 50 trillion cells. Each cell is differentiated into various tissues and organs, as we were talking about earlier, right? But ultimately, the important part is not any of those individual cells. The important part is the collection of relationships that those cells have that comprise me. There's a second big piece I need to add here to make sure that we get to where we're going this morning. A huge piece of process theology is our free will. Tying this back to conversations about God, this comes out as God not being all-powerful and in control of the universe. We are really free to make choices about how we live our lives. This comes out in physics as well, in a way. The deeper scientists get into experiments trying to predict the orbit of an electron around an atom, for example, the more they are confounded by the subatomic particles so often behaving in very weird and almost chaotic ways. Expand that up to the human level, and we're talking about free will, choice, agency. So we have these two big ideas found in their versions in modern physics that are in process theology. One idea reveals our interrelatedness, that the interaction of events is the essential element of life, and the other is that life is not predestined, that we have somewhere between chaos and agency a capacity for free will to choose what path we take in our lives. Now let me tell you about the lure, because without the lure, everything so far is just random and purely chaotic, and yet somehow there's life, somehow we have a pumpkin. In process theology, God's power is not a matter of control and dominance. God can't make things happen, but God is a loving power, a transformative power, a persuasive rather than coercive power. God lures us toward the good, toward love, toward justice. So when we talk about how the arc of the moral universe is long but it bends toward justice, in process theology it would be bending because God is luring us to behave in more just ways. Not because God is making it that way, but because God is luring us to make it that way. In every case, it's up to us to make it more just. You can think of the timeline of your life, for example, as a tree in winter. The trunk is a single line showing what has already happened in your life. It's written. It's happened. The rest of what happens is this branching possibilities. Now, in some theologies, God has already determined your life, your whole life, and the tree metaphor here is more like a telephone pole. You're just going to go along the path God already set out for you and just enjoy the ride. That's predeterminism. Process theology strongly disagrees with this idea. Process theology says that instead, God lures you to follow one branch in particular, perhaps, but it's up to you to do that or not. God doesn't know already which branch you're going to follow. You really are free. We have options. And we're drawn towards certain options in process theology. God is luring us to being good and just and loving. So that is process theology. I mean, of course, there's a great deal more to it, but for our purposes this morning, this is process theology. Events and experiences are are the root element of reality. We're free to choose a path, and there is a lure for us to be our best selves, to be on a path that is a path of goodness and love. Now, for most people, the source of that lure is God. So how do you have a process theology without any reference to God? Certainly, you can still have an honoring and recognition of events and experiences, of the interrelatedness of everything. You can have an honoring and a recognition of free will, even the centrality of change as a dominant feature of life. But how do you do that without including God as a lure? I can imagine 3 ways to do it. I can imagine 3 different ways to hold a process theology perspective without a God element, without there being a divine will serving as this lure that we follow. First, we can keep a purely atheistic, naturalistic perspective. This keeps everything explained about life solidly in the realm of science. We have followed everything we learn. We know that new experiments can give us new information, that biology and psychology and sociology provide a lot of insight into what we call good. Perhaps that's where you are. Most people want to be good people. That's just how we as social creatures are. And we can quibble about what we mean by the word good. That's just what it means to be human sometimes. There are other forces within us that are destructive, that are divisive, and we can see that we can understand that, and we can appreciate the value of goodness without it being entangled with some concept of God. For some people, that's enough. Next, we can take a semantic pass, if you will, on the question. We don't use the word God, but we might refer to something like life with a capital L, or the holy with a capital H. This is a substitution that puts some distance from the word God, because whatever it is that we mean, it's not what most people think of when we use the word God, with a personality and maybe a thunderbolt. Certainly not. And this is not merely pretending that we're not talking about God either. We are trying to avoid the assumptions too often tangled up with the language. It's an attempt to include certain characteristics and not include other characteristics in this conversation about the holy. And for some people, that's enough. And then there's a third option that I'm thinking of. We can just talk about a mystery. We could talk about the unknown. It's an acknowledgement that what we do know now does not yet satisfy us, but doesn't mean that we need to jump to using the word God to cover whatever we don't understand. There seems to be a lure. In my experience, I'm drawn to behave with compassion, and I want to be just and good and kind. Even when I'm not good at it, I want to be. Why? I'm not sure. And for some people, that's enough. Now, I say all of this as someone who does believe in God. I'm not trying to suggest that you should or should not believe in one version of this that I've talked about or anything like that. I'm trying instead to suggest that you work out your own understanding as best you can in keeping with your experiences and with your faith. We are interconnected and dynamic and always expanding. We grow and we learn by asking more questions, testing what we think we know. So explore. Consider how you are drawn to behave, how you might feel a tug to be in the world in a certain way. Consider this lure to being good. Process theology asks us to keep seeking, to let science define the natural world while we stay true to that knowledge, and it asks us to allow the love that is God to lure us into better ways of being in the world, or to allow the love that might be by another name lure us into being better in the world, or by whatever framework you put it in. Follow that lure to build a better world. And some people, it is enough to simply follow the lure, to live justly, to offer compassionate mercy, and to follow your path with humility in the face of all that is holy. In a world without end, may it be so.